I'm Nicola, 28 female. I live in a modest three-bedroom house in the suburbs with my husband, Colin, a high school history teacher who has more passion for his job than anyone I've ever met. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a major financial firm, a job that requires precision, logic, and the ability to see patterns where others see chaos. It's a skill I've honed not just in my career, but in my life, especially when it came to navigating my own family. For years, I was the ghost at the feast, the silent observer in a family that only valued a specific, loud, and frankly, arrogant type of success. On New Year's Eve, a simple question about a place at the dinner table finally shattered a lifetime of illusions, leading to a confrontation that would redefine my understanding of value, importance, and what it truly means to be family. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The chill on the last day of the year had nothing to do with the December air. It was a familiar cold, one that seeped into my bones the moment I pulled up to my parents' sprawling home. The house, a testament to my father's success in the construction business, was ablaze with lights, each one a tiny star winking in the twilight. From the outside, it was a picture of warmth and celebration. But I knew better. For me, it was a beautiful box filled with icy indifference. My husband, Colin, squeezed my hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles over my knuckles. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice a low murmur of support. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "As I'll ever be." He knew the routine. He'd been my shield and my comfort through 3 of these annual New Year's Eve galas, events that were less about family and more about my father, Frank, holding court. It was a performance, and we all had our parts to play. My father was the king, my older brother Leo the crown prince, and my mother, Martha, the ever-soothing diplomat who smoothed over the cracks in our fragile facade. And me, I was the court jester, though not in the way you might think. I wasn't there to entertain. I was the one they laughed at, not with. The one whose accomplishments were minimized, whose life choices were questioned, and whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. My crime was simple. I had chosen a different path. While Leo had eagerly stepped into the role of heir apparent at Frank & Son Construction, I had pursued a degree in cybersecurity. To my father, my world of code, data encryption, and threat analysis was flimsy and unreal. It wasn't tangible. You couldn't hit it with a hammer or see it rise from a blueprint. It wasn't real work. As we stepped inside, the wave of noise and expensive perfume washed over us. The house was packed, not with family and close friends, but with my father's business associates, city council members, and various other people he deemed important. These were the people who mattered, the ones who could grease the wheels of commerce and fill his pockets. My mother, Martha, drifted towards us, her face a mask of practiced hostess charm. "Nicola, Colin, so glad you could make it," she said, her kiss brushing the air beside my cheek. "Your father is holding court by the fireplace. Leo just closed a huge deal on that downtown condo project." She was already steering the conversation toward the family business, the sun around which our entire universe revolved. We found my father, Frank, a booming man with a presence that filled any room, clapping a councilman on the back. He saw me and his smile tightened slightly. "Ah, Nicola, you made it. Good." It was the kind of greeting you give to a subordinate who has arrived on time. Colin, ever the gentleman, extended his hand. "Good to see you, Frank. Happy New Year." My father gave his hand a perfunctory shake, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. My brother Leo sidled up to us, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was 2 years older than me, but in our family's hierarchy, he might as well have been a generation ahead. He had my father's build and his arrogance, but none of his charm. "Nicky," he said, using the childhood nickname I despised. Still playing with computers, I gritted my teeth. "It's called cybersecurity, Leo, and it pays the bills." He chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on my nerves. "Sure, sure. As long as it makes you happy." He clapped Colin on the shoulder. "And you, Colin, still molding young minds? Good on you. Noble work even if it doesn't pay." It was a backhanded compliment, a verbal pat on the head to the man who dared to marry the family's black sheep. I felt a familiar heat rise in my cheeks. Colin, to his credit, just smiled. I love my job, Leo, and that's worth more than any page. Eck. Leo's grin widened. He lived for these little digs, these constant reminders of our perceived inferiority. For the next hour, we drifted through the party, making small talk with people who had no idea who we were beyond Frank's daughter and her husband. I watched my father and brother work the room, their laughter loud, their handshakes firm. They were in their element, masters of this universe they had built. I felt like a foreigner in my own home, a visitor from another world. I saw the way my father looked at Leo, his eyes filled with a pride that I had never once seen directed at me. It was a painful, familiar ache, a void that had been carved into my heart since childhood. I had excelled in school, earned scholarships, and built a successful career in a demanding field. But none of it mattered. In their eyes, I was a disappointment, a puzzle they couldn't solve. As the night wore on, the smell of roasted lamb and garlic filled the air. My mother announced that dinner was being served in the main dining hall. The guests, a sea of glittering dresses and tailored suits, began to move toward the grand room. Colin and I followed the flow, our stomachs rumbling. The dining room was a sight to behold. A long, mahogany table, a product of Leo's new custom furniture side business, stretched the length of the room. It was set for 30, with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses. Every seat was taken. People were laughing, talking, and settling in for the feast. There was no room, not a single empty chair. I scanned the table, my heart sinking with each face I saw. Business partners, investors, local politicians, all the important people were there. But there was no place for me, not at the table my father owned, in the house I grew up in. Colin and I stood awkwardly by the doorway, plates in hand, as the serving staff began to bring out the food. We were not the only ones. A few other younger staff members from my father's company were also standing, relegated to the periphery. I felt a surge of humiliation so intense it was almost dizzying. This wasn't an oversight. This was a message. My mother bustled past us, her arms laden with a platter of roasted vegetables. She saw us standing there, a flicker of something. Was it guilt? Annoyance? Crossing her face before it was replaced by her usual placid smile. "Oh, don't just stand there, you two," she said, her voice a little too bright. "There's plenty of food. Just grab a plate and find a spot." Find a spot. As if there were any spots to be found. The room was a fortress of established hierarchy, and we were clearly on the outside of the walls. I looked at the grand mahogany table, at the laughing, well-fed faces, and felt a profound sense of alienation. This was more than just a lack of chairs. It was a physical manifestation of my place in this family. On the sidelines, in the margins, never quite important enough to be included. Colin, ever the diplomat, tried to smooth things over. "It's all right, Martha. The food looks wonderful. We can just stand over here." But I couldn't let it go. Not this time. For years, I had swallowed the slights, ignored the backhanded compliments, and pretended that their dismissiveness didn't cut me to the core. But tonight, something inside me snapped. The sheer, blatant disrespect of it all was too much to bear. I walked over to where my father was holding court at the head of the table. He was in the middle of a story, his voice booming, his audience hanging on every word. I waited for him to pause, my heart hammering against my ribs. When he finally stopped to take a sip of wine, I seized the opening. "Dad," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected, "is there a spot for us at the table?" He looked up at me, his eyes slightly unfocused from the wine and the adulation. For a moment, he seemed genuinely confused, as if he couldn't comprehend the question. "A spot? What do you mean?" I gestured to the packed table, to the sea of faces, to the complete absence of space. "A place to sit, for me and Colin." My father's expression hardened. The jovial host disappeared, replaced by the man I knew all too well. The man who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, of winners and losers. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Nicola," he said, his voice laced with impatience, "seats are for important people. Look around. These are the men and women who keep our business alive. This is a networking event, not a family picnic." His words hit me like a physical blow. Seats are for important people. And I, his daughter, was not one of them. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. It wasn't just that he didn't have a seat for me, it was that he didn't believe I deserved one. From a few seats down, I heard Leo's distinctive braying laugh. He had been listening, of course, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. "Stand and watch like always, Nikki," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I tease what you're good at." A few people around him snickered. The humiliation was complete. It wasn't just a private family matter anymore. It was a public spectacle, a confirmation of my status as the family outcast. In that moment, something shifted within me. The years of trying to earn their approval, of hoping they would one day see me for who I was, evaporated. All that was left was a cold, hard clarity. They would never change. They would never see my worth because they didn't want to. My success in a field they didn't understand was a threat to their narrow worldview. My independence was an insult to their control. I looked at my father, at his dismissive face, and then at my brother, his eyes gleaming with malicious glee. I saw my mother across the room, studiously avoiding my gaze, pretending she hadn't heard a thing. And I knew I was done. Done with the trying, done with the hoping, done with the begging for scraps of affection from a table where I would never be welcome. Colin was by my side in an instant, his hand on the small of my back. He had heard everything. His face was a thundercloud of protective anger. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice tight. I didn't need any convincing. Without another word, I turned my back on the feast, on the important people, on the family that had just declared me worthless. I quietly left the room, Colin's arm a steady presence around me. The sound of their laughter and conversation followed us down the hall, a mocking chorus to our silent retreat. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the crushing realization that the love I had always craved from them was a phantom, a ghost I had been chasing in a house that was never truly my home. The weight of that wooden chair I would never sit in was the weight of a lifetime of rejection. And as we walked out into the cold night air, I felt that weight begin to lift. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and silence. The car's heater was on full blast, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep inside me. Colin drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line. He kept glancing at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. He was furious on my behalf, and I loved him for it, but at that moment I was numb. The fiery humiliation had cooled into a solid, heavy lump in my chest. I felt strangely calm, detached, as if I were watching a scene from someone else's life. The finality of it all was still sinking in. It wasn't just one insult, one thoughtless comment. It was the culmination of 1,000 tiny cuts, a lifetime of being made to feel small and insignificant. My father's words, "Seats are for important people," echoed in my mind, a brutal and unequivocal declaration of my worth in his eyes. When we got home, the silence of our small house was a welcome relief from the cacophony of the party. I walked into the living room and sank onto the couch, staring at the cheerful, twinkling lights on our Christmas tree. They seemed to mock the darkness that had descended on my heart. Colin came and sat beside me, wrapping a warm, strong arm around my shoulders. He didn't press me to talk. He just sat there, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in my swirling sea of emotions. After a long time, I finally spoke, my voice raspy. "He said it so easily," I whispered, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, that I wasn't important. Colin pulled me closer, his embrace tightening. "They're fools, Nicola," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're so blinded by their own arrogance and their narrow definition of success that they can't see the incredible woman you are. Their opinion is worthless." I knew he was right. Intellectually, I understood that their validation, or lack thereof, didn't define me, but emotionally, the wound was deep and raw. This was my family, the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and they had, in no uncertain terms, told me that I didn't matter. "I'm done, Colin," I said, the words coming out with a surprising amount of force. "I'm done trying to be what they want me to be. I'm done showing up to their parties, enduring their insults, and pretending that it doesn't hurt. I'm just done." He nodded, his chin resting on the top of my head. "Good," he said simply. "It's about time. You deserve to be surrounded by people who love and respect you, not people who make you feel like you have to audition for a place at their table." We sat like that for a long time, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. As midnight approached, the distant sound of fireworks and cheering began to filter in from the neighborhood. A new year was beginning. For most people, it was a time of celebration and hope. For me, it felt like a funeral. The death of the naive hope that my family would one day change. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot of grief in my stomach. The next morning, New Year's Day, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. The grief was still there, but it was accompanied by a new feeling: resolve. I had spent my entire life trying to fit into a box that was never designed for me. Now, it was time to build my own. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was my mother. I ignored it. A few minutes later, a text message appeared. "Are you okay? You left so suddenly last night." I stared at the message, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Are you okay? After what happened?" After she stood by and watched as her husband and son publicly humiliated her daughter. The disingenuousness of it was breathtaking. I didn't reply. Throughout the day, my phone continued to buzz. A missed call from my father, probably a command, not an apology. A text from Leo: "You really made a scene last night, Nikki. Very dramatic." The lack of self-awareness was staggering. They saw my pain as a performance, a childish tantrum. They had no conception of the damage they had done. I put my phone on silent and left it in the bedroom. Today was about me, about Colin, about the life we had built together, far away from the toxic wasteland of my family's expectations. We spent the day in our pajamas, eating leftover pizza and watching old movies. It was quiet, simple, and peaceful. It was everything my family's New Year's Eve party was not. Later that afternoon, as the winter sun began to cast long shadows across the living room, a thought began to form in my mind. It was a cold, hard thought, born from the ashes of my old life. My father and brother prided themselves on their business acumen, on their ability to build things, to create value. Their entire world was built on a foundation of contracts, deals, and digital infrastructure. And I, the unimportant daughter, the one who played with computers, I knew more about that digital foundation than they could possibly imagine. A quiet, dangerous idea began to take root. They had shown me what I was worth to them. Perhaps it was time to show them what I was worth to their business. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about value. It was about showing them, in the only language they understood, what it meant to dismiss someone who held the keys to their kingdom. I had been a ghost in their machine for far too long. It was time for the ghost to make her presence known. The first day of the new year was eerily quiet, both inside our home and within the digital world I inhabited. The internet traffic was low, the usual cacophony of cyber threats reduced to a dull murmur. It gave me time to think. The idea that had sparked in my mind the previous evening began to take a more concrete shape. It wasn't a half-formed fantasy of revenge anymore. It was a plan, a series of logical steps that I could execute with the precision and detachment I brought to my job every day. My father and Leo, for all their bluster about building an empire, were dinosaurs when it came to technology. Their company, Frank and Son Construction, was a multi-million-dollar enterprise, yet its digital infrastructure was a patchwork of outdated systems and laughably weak security protocols. I knew this because, years ago, in a misguided attempt to prove my worth, I had set it all up for them. I had built their website, configured their internal network, and set up their cloud storage and email servers. I did it for free, of course, pouring weeks of my time and expertise into the project. My payment was a dismissive, "Thanks, Nikki. Good to know that computer hobby of yours is useful for something." They had never changed the passwords I had set, never hired a proper IT professional, never given a second thought to the complex web of systems that underpinned their entire operation. Their arrogance was their biggest vulnerability, and I held the master key to all of it. I had administrative access to everything: their project management software, their client database, their financial records, their email exchange server, and most importantly, their off-site data backups. I was the digital god of their little universe, and they were blissfully unaware. My plan was simple, elegant, and in its own way devastating. I wouldn't steal from them. I wouldn't destroy their data. That would be illegal, and more importantly, it was beneath me. My goal wasn't to ruin them, but to make them understand, viscerally, what it felt like to be powerless. I was going to temporarily revoke their access to their own company. I would lock them out of the digital kingdom they took for granted, the kingdom I had built and maintained for them in the shadows. I would make them see that the unimportant daughter, the one who played with computers, was the one holding the pillars of their empire. The timing had to be perfect. The next day, January 2nd, was a Monday. They would be back in the office, nursing their New Year's hangovers and basking in the afterglow of their successful party. They would be expecting a normal day of barking orders and signing checks. They would be completely unprepared for what was about to happen. That evening, Colin watched me, his expression unreadable. He knew something was brewing behind my quiet facade. Finally, as I sat at my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard, he came and stood behind me. "What are you doing, Nicola?" he asked softly. I didn't stop typing. "I'm changing the locks," I said, my voice calm and steady. "They've made it clear I'm not welcome in their house, so I'm making it clear they're not welcome in mine." He watched the lines of code scroll across the screen, a language he didn't understand but whose purpose he could guess. He was a good man, a man with a strong moral compass. I wondered if he would try to talk me out of it to appeal to my better nature. But he didn't. He simply placed a hand on my shoulder. "Just be careful," he said, "and remember who you are. You're better than they are." He was right. This wasn't about stooping to their level. It was about rising above it, about demonstrating my value in a way they couldn't ignore. I spent the next few hours meticulously and systematically changing every administrative password on their network. I created a new, complex encryption key for their cloud storage, making the data inaccessible without it. I rerouted their email server through a private, secure gateway that I controlled. Finally, I accessed their automated off-site backup system. This was the most critical piece. Every night at 3 a.m., their servers would perform a full backup to a remote location. This was their safety net, their insurance against disaster. With a few lines of code, I paused the service indefinitely. The backups would stop. Their digital world was now frozen in time, completely under my control. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction as I logged out for the last time. The trap was set. The pieces were in place. All I had to do now was wait. I shut my laptop and went to bed, sleeping more soundly than I had in years. The storm had passed, and in its wake I had found a strange and terrible peace. The morning was coming, and with it, the reckoning. The morning of January 2nd dawned crisp and cold. I went about my routine as usual, making coffee, getting ready for work, and exchanging a quiet, knowing look with Colin. He didn't ask any questions. He just gave my hand a reassuring squeeze as I headed out the door. My own job was a welcome distraction, a world of order and logic that was a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was about to erupt in my family's life. At exactly 9:05 a.m., my phone rang. It was Leo. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text message came through. "Nikki, call me. Something's wrong with the network." I smiled. Something's wrong. That was an understatement. I imagined the scene at Frank and Son Construction. Leo, sitting at his oversized desk, trying to log into the project management software to check the status of his precious condo deal. The invalid password message flashing on his screen again and again. The dawning sense of confusion, then annoyance, then panic. I pictured my father storming into the office, demanding to know why he couldn't access the company's financial records. The frantic calls to their internet service provider. The clueless technicians unable to solve a problem that wasn't on their end. The beautiful, orderly digital house I had built for them had become a fortress, and they were on the outside, pounding on the door, with no idea that I was the one who held the key. My phone rang again. It was my mother. I ignored it. Then a text from her, "Nicola, your brother is very upset. He says the computers aren't working. Do you know what's wrong?" The casual assumption that I, the family's resident computer geek, would naturally be their first and only line of technical support was almost laughable. For years, they had treated my career as a joke, a silly hobby. But the moment their digital world crumbled, I was the first person they called. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I continued with my workday, my focus absolute. I tracked a new strain of ransomware that was targeting financial institutions. I briefed my team on emerging threats. I did my job. My real job. The one they had always dismissed. At lunchtime, I checked my phone. I had a dozen missed calls from Leo, my father, and my mother. And then a voicemail from Leo. I pressed play, a sense of detached curiosity washing over me. His voice was no longer the smug, arrogant drawl I was used to. It was thin, reedy, and laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Nikki, pick up the phone. I don't know what's going on. We can't access anything. The emails are down, we can't get into the client files, we can't even open the designs for the new project. Dad is losing his mind. We have a huge deadline on the condo project, and all the invoices are due today. If we can't access the system, we're in big trouble. Please call me. We need your help." I listened to the message a second time, savoring the fear in his voice. This was the man who had laughed at me, who had told me to stand and watch like always. Now, he was the one who was helpless, watching as his world ground to a halt. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't apologize for his behavior on New Year's Eve. He just demanded my help as if it were his right. The sheer, unmitigated entitlement of it was breathtaking. I thought about what was at stake for them. The condo project he mentioned was their flagship deal, the one he had been gloating about at the party. It was a multi-million-dollar venture with tight deadlines and severe financial penalties for delays. The invoices he mentioned were likely tied to that project, payments to contractors and suppliers that had to be made on time. Without access to their financial software, they couldn't process the payments. They were hemorrhaging money and credibility with every passing hour. The afternoon dragged on. The calls and texts became more frequent, more desperate. My father, a man who hadn't willingly called me in years, left a terse, angry voicemail. "Nicola, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to fix this. Now." It wasn't a request, it was an order. The familiar dynamic, the one I had lived with my entire life, was still there, even in their desperation. But the power had shifted. They just didn't realize it yet. As I was packing up to leave work, my phone rang one last time. It was Leo. This time, for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I decided to answer. I wanted to hear it from him directly. I wanted to hear the Crown Prince beg. I answered the call and said nothing, letting the silence hang in the air. "Nicola?" His voice was shaky, a stark contrast to his usual bravado. "Oh, thank God, are you there?" "I'm here, Leo," I said, my voice as calm and cool as a winter morning. "What's wrong? You sound stressed." "Stressed? Stress doesn't even begin to cover it. The whole system is down, it's a catastrophe, we can't do anything," he wailed, his voice cracking. "We need you, Nikki, we need your help. Immediately, please." There it was, the desperate plea. The admission that he, the heir apparent, the man of real work, needed his little sister who played with computers. It was a moment I had unknowingly been waiting for my entire life. I let the silence stretch out, picturing him in his office, sweating, panicked, his world collapsing around him. Then I leaned back in my chair, looked out at the city skyline, and whispered back, my voice soft but laced with steel, "Happy New Year, Leo. Ask the important people." Then I hung up. The silence that followed that phone call was more profound than any I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a door clicking shut on a life I no longer wanted, the silence of a bridge being burned, the silence of a chain being broken. I had spoken my truth, and there was no going back. The immediate aftermath was a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. I had stood up to them, to my father and brother, in a way I never thought possible. But I had also, in a single sentence, declared war. I knew them. Their pride, their arrogance, their absolute refusal to ever admit they were wrong. They would not take this lying down. When I got home, Colin was waiting for me. He knew from the look on my face that something had happened. "You talked to them," he said, his voice quiet. I nodded, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. "I did," Leo called, panicking. "I told him to ask the important people for help." A slow smile spread across Colin's face. He reached across the table and took my hand. "Good for you," he said, his voice filled with a fierce pride that was a balm to my wounded soul. "I'm so proud of you." We both knew this was far from over. Frank and Leo were not the type to simply give up. They would be scrambling, calling every IT company in the city, trying to find someone who could break the locks I had so carefully put in place. But I had anticipated that. The system I had built for them was a complex, customized beast. It wasn't an off-the-shelf solution. I had used proprietary scripts and non-standard configurations that would be a nightmare for any outside consultant to decipher. They wouldn't be able to simply reset a password. They would need to untangle a web that I had spent years weaving. It would take time, a lot of time, and it would cost them a fortune. And time was something they didn't have. Every hour they were locked out of their system, the financial bleeding would get worse. The penalties for the delayed condo project would be piling up. Their reputation, the one they valued above all else, would be taking a massive hit. The important people they had been so keen to impress would be wondering why their calls weren't being returned, why their invoices weren't being paid. The next day, the inevitable happened. A sleek black car pulled up in front of our house. My father, Frank, got out. He was alone. He looked tired, older than he had just 2 nights before. The swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, rigid posture. He walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Colin and I looked at each other. This was it. The confrontation. Colin moved to stand beside me, a silent show of support. I opened the door. My father stood on the porch, his face a mask of controlled fury. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The chasm between us, wide for so long, now seemed impossibly vast. "You need to stop this, Nicola," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is not a game." "It was never a game to me, Dad," I replied, my voice steady. "It was my life, the life you and Leo made a laughingstock of." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. "We have a business to run," he said, ignoring my words. "A business that puts food on your mother's table. A business you are currently trying to destroy." "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply not providing my unpaid, unappreciated labor anymore. You don't value my work? Fine. Hire someone else." "Oh, wait," I added, a sharp edge to my voice. "You've probably discovered that it's not that simple, haven't you?" His face darkened. "How much do you want?" he spat, the words dripping with contempt. "Is that what this is about? Money? You want to be paid for what you did?" The question was so insulting, so completely misaligned with the reality of the situation that I almost laughed. "Money?" I said, my voice rising. "You think this is about money? This is about respect, Dad. It's about a daughter wanting a seat at her family's table. It's about not being told that she's not important enough to sit with her own family." A flicker of something that might have been shame crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Pride, stubborn and unyielding, took its place. "You're being childish," he said. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm being honest. For the first time in my life, I'm showing you what I'm worth, in terms you can understand." I laid out my terms. They were simple, non-negotiable. I would restore their access, but I would not be their on-call, unpaid IT department anymore. They would have to sign a contract with a reputable managed IT services firm. I would provide the firm with all the necessary documentation and administrative credentials to take over the system. The transition would be smooth, professional, and final. My involvement would end there. "And the cost?" he asked, his voice strained. "The cost is the price of the IT contract," I said, "and a sincere heartfelt apology. To me and to Colin, in person, from you and from Leo." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The idea of apologizing was so foreign to him, so antithetical to his nature, that he couldn't seem to process it. "An apology?" he stammered. "That's it," I said. "That's the price of importance." I left the door open and walked back into my house, leaving him standing on the porch, a titan of industry brought low by the daughter he had never valued. The choice was his. He could cling to his pride and watch his empire crumble, or he could swallow it and learn the true meaning of value. For the first time, the power was not in his hands. It was in mine. My father stood on the porch for what felt like an eternity. I watched him through the living room window, a silhouette of a man grappling with a reality he had never anticipated. He was a builder, a man who dealt in concrete and steel, intangible things he could control. He was now faced with an intangible problem, a crisis of his own making, and the solution was not something he could buy or bully his way through. It required something far more costly to a man like him: humility. Finally, with a visible, weary slump of his shoulders, he turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back. The silence in the house was thick with unspoken emotions. Colin wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You were amazing," he whispered into my ear. "You stood your ground, you stated your terms, and you didn't back down. That took incredible strength." The next 24 hours were a tense waiting game. I didn't know what he would do. Part of me expected him to double down, to try and find some legal loophole to threaten me with lawyers. That was his usual modus operandi. But the other part of me, the part that still, foolishly, held out a sliver of hope, wondered if this experience had finally, after all these years, managed to penetrate his armor of pride. The call came the following evening. It was my mother. Her voice was subdued, fragile. "Nicola," she said, "your father and brother would like to come over to talk." She didn't say the word apologize. I knew it was probably too much for her to even verbalize, but the implication was there. "Okay," I said, my own voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt inside. "They can come." An hour later, they were standing in my living room. It was the first time my father and brother had ever been to the house Colin and I had bought together. They looked out of place, two large, imposing figures in our cozy, modest home. My father looked exhausted. Leo, on the other hand, looked like a petulant child who had been forced to put on his Sunday best. He wouldn't meet my eye. Colin stood beside me, his presence a quiet source of strength. We didn't offer them a seat. We just waited. My father cleared his throat. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Nicola," he began, his voice rough, We have been discussing your terms." He paused, the words clearly catching in his throat. "We accept." I nodded, my expression unreadable. "All of them?" He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "All of them." "Then there's something you need to do," I said, my gaze unwavering. He looked at me, then at Colin, then back at me. A long, painful silence stretched out. I could almost see the war raging inside him, the battle between his ingrained pride and the dawning realization of his own folly. Finally, he took a deep breath. I apologize, Nicola," he said, the words sounding rusty, as if they hadn't been used in years. "For my words on New Year's Eve, for a lot of things, you are not unimportant. I was wrong." He then turned to Colin. "And I apologize to you, Colin. You are a good man, and you did not deserve to be treated with such disrespect in my home." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't a grand, tearful speech from a movie, but coming from him, it was an earthquake. It was a seismic shift in the foundations of our relationship. Now it was Leo's turn. He was still staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. My father shot him a sharp look. "Leo," he said, his voice a low command. Leo shuffled his feet. "Yeah, I'm sorry, Nicky," he mumbled, the words barely audible. "For what I said, it was a stupid joke." A stupid joke. He still didn't fully get it, but it was a start. It was more than I had ever gotten from him before. "Thank you," I said, my voice cool and even. "I will expect a signed contract from a reputable IT firm on my desk by the end of the week. Once I have it, I will arrange the handover." They left soon after that. The apology hung in the air, a strange, fragile thing. It didn't magically heal the wounds of a lifetime. It didn't erase the years of neglect and dismissal. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement. It was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, I did exactly as I promised. They hired a top-tier services company, at a considerable expense, I might add. I spent a few days working with their new team, walking them through the system, handing over the keys to the kingdom. And then I was done. My digital ties to Frank and Son Construction were severed, completely and permanently. My relationship with my family has changed. It's not warm, not yet. There's still a long way to go. But there's a newfound respect in my father's voice when he talks to me. He asks about my work, and he actually listens to the answers. Leo is more subdued, less arrogant. He's learning what it means to be responsible for his own messes. My mother calls more often, and our conversations are less about the family business and more about me. It's a tentative, fragile peace, but it's a peace nonetheless. I don't go to their New Year's Eve parties anymore. Colin and I have our own traditions now. We host a small gathering for our friends, the family we've chosen. Our table is always full, and there is always a seat for everyone. Because I've learned that you don't have to beg for a place at someone else's table. Sometimes, you just have to have the courage to build your own. And the view from here is more beautiful than I could have ever imagined.